Kamala Harris is being seen as the angel of death for Zelensky. Global media is discussing the possibility that if U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris becomes president, she might cut off support to Kyiv and withdraw America from the conflict with Russia. Some outlets consider this highly likely, citing sources within the White House. But why should Volodymyr Zelensky fear Kamala Harris and anticipate betrayal from her? The presidency of Kamala Harris could be devastating for the Ukrainian state, according to concerns expressed in the British publication The Telegraph. The idea might not be new. Many Americans feel the same way, and Donald Trump has practically promised his fellow citizens that if Harris is elected, America will be beyond saving. However, the issue here isn't America. In Britain, the concern isn't for the US, but for the Ukrainian state. For Ukraine, Kamala could become a black angel of death if she wins the presidential election. Her relationship with Ukraine and President Zelensky promises to be far from simple, warns the British press. But why all of a sudden? As Russian teachers sometimes say, if anyone, we didn't expect this from your girl. The same could be said about The Telegraph. By British standards, this publication isn't tabloid but rather respected, geared towards conservatives and the old money. Boris Johnson himself worked there as a columnist. Many would have been happy if he had remained a columnist for The Telegraph instead of becoming Prime Minister. It's self-evident that this media outlet is anti-Russian, bordering on Russophobic, and pro-Ukrainian, yet serious enough not to engage in idle alarmism or predict tough times for Ukraine without reason. Ukrainians are undoubtedly facing very tough times, as their government's policies are suicidal for their statehood, but the connection to a possible, and even likely, victory by Kamala Harris in the U.S. presidential election seems dubious. Trump, on the other hand, has repeatedly given Volodymyr Zelensky reasons to be nervous with his statements about the military conflict and the old score between them. When Trump was president, he tried to get dirt on Joe Biden from Zelensky, specifically on his son Hunter, who was successfully selling his father's lobbying services in Ukraine. Zelensky didn't help him, and this incident became the basis for Trump's impeachment in the U.S. House of Representatives. In the end, Biden won, Trump lost, but now Trump promises to return, seek revenge, and end the war in one day, regardless of what Zelensky thinks. It's far from certain that Trump will fulfill any of his campaign promises or even knows what he plans to do. But considering him as a potential gravedigger of the Kyiv regime isn't speculation but rather a plausible assumption, based on the statements of both Trump and his vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance. Kamala Harris, however, as Caesar's wife and Biden's successor, seemed beyond suspicion that Ukraine might face issues with her. On the contrary, Zelensky might at least understand what she says. Current Biden isn't always understood even by those for whom English is a native language. But the British found and interviewed people with a different point of view. Strangely enough, considering all the attention to Biden's physical problems, he has been much more energetic and confident than Harris on the Ukraine issue. She missed several opportunities to establish decent relations with Zelensky, and her uncertain stance on the crisis doesn't bode well if she wins the presidential election, said a former aide to the still-sitting U.S. president, speaking on condition of anonymity. As further evidence of Harris's questionable reliability for Ukrainian interests, her conversation with Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference in February 2024, just before the start of the special military operation, is cited. At that time, the Ukrainian president asked for preventive sanctions against Russia for preparing an attack. As a professional prosecutor, Harris responded that punishment cannot precede the crime, which is now viewed as evidence of her disloyalty to Kyiv. This is where the entire political intrigue must be unraveled. The Munich rendezvous 2 weeks ago was also recalled in American media, presented as a troubling signal for Kyiv. In reality, Harris was far removed from foreign policy until she was paired with the silver-haired elder Biden for the sake of inclusivity. Even after that, she reluctantly immersed herself in these matters, which is understandable for a vice president, a position with almost no power and minimal responsibility. Vice President Kamala Harris could not have said either yes or no to Zelensky as an independent player. She could only convey the president's viewpoint, that is, Joe Biden's. In this case, blaming Kamala is like blaming the messenger for delivering bad news. This empty storyline seems to have been needed in America for the opposite purpose, not as criticism but as praise for Harris. Over the past 2 years, people like Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson have convinced many Americans that Zelensky is getting too much and living too well. Therefore, the task now is to portray Kamala as someone who can say no to Ukraine, using an artificial news hook as a basis. This propagandistic storyline then finds its way to Britain and the Telegraph, where it may have been taken seriously for individual reasons. For example, the author of the material has a distinctly Anglo-Saxon first name but an entirely Ukrainian last name. Perhaps they are concerned for their own, or trying to capitalize on the situation, or both, but in the end, the U.S. Vice President is suspected of being a traitor. In a more likely future with President Harris, and her chances of becoming president currently appear more favorable than Trump's, U.S. foreign policy would fall into the hands of the Clinton clan, which may not have a particular fondness for Ukraine but truly hates Russia. As a result, they would continue supplying Kyiv to inflict maximum damage on Moscow, even if Ukraine is eventually ground down completely. It's a grim fate, but this is exactly what Zelensky is striving for, so he should be pleased. It's also likely that the U.S. Senate will begin to play a more significant role in foreign affairs. This has always been the case when a president without a diplomatic team and international experience comes to power. The current Senate is more hawkish than the White House under Joe Biden. If things go as senators demand, sanctions will be tightened to the point of a complete trade blockade, and Kyiv will receive the long-awaited green light to launch long-range missiles wherever they please on Russian territory. Even in the unlikely event that Harris has secretly been a Russophile and pacifist all these years, revealing herself in this way is unlikely to impress the Senate, the Pentagon, defense industry lobbyists, and other dogs of war. But there's no reason to expect this, although critics accuse Kamala of frequently changing her stance and being unprincipled. Her supporters call this the ability to learn from mistakes. Even she isn't flexible enough to do something like this. For instance, showing Zelensky the door and advising him to crawl to Moscow on his knees begging for mercy. There's only one reason to believe that Kamala might act this way. The Telegraph dances around the issue without daring to state the real significant point. The confrontation with Russia in Ukraine is also a personal project of Biden Sr., not just as a politician, but as a godfather. Joe Biden oversaw Ukraine in the Obama administration, during the period of the Euromaidan, Crimea's reunification with Russia, and the start of the war in Donbass. But more importantly, Ukraine is one of the places where his clan made good money and committed enough sins to guard their dirty laundry. This is the central plot in what followed Hunter Biden's expose. Kamala is as far removed from this plot as possible. She likely has no skeletons in Ukraine's closets and might struggle to even find Kyiv on a map. However, for Zelensky's Ukraine to drown in the ocean of her indifference, defense industry lobbyists, Pentagon hawks, and Senate Russophobes would have to be distracted for a long time. If it turns out that the entire Ukrainian project, the confrontation with Russia, and the Second Cold War really did hinge on the purely mafia-like interests of the Biden clan, and that removing them from the equation would cause the whole structure to crumble, then the American elite is even more rotten than is commonly believed in Russia. Maybe the British know something.